Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and on behalf of the National Review Institute and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, of which I am the founder, welcome to our panel discussion of U.S.-Taiwan relations at really a critical time in U.S. and, for that matter, in global world history. Just a few words to put our discussion in context. U.S. foreign policy is most effective when it strikes a balance between idealism and realism that then gains the support of the majority of the American people. And when foreign policy, however, becomes either too idealistic or too realistic, public support wanes. What then should our policy be toward the Republic of China on Taiwan, a democracy, a longtime trading partner, and a critical ally during World War II? In 1979, the U.S. officially recognized Communist China, de-recognized the Republic of China. Since then, the United States has continued to deal with both governments, albeit in different capacities. The looming Taiwan crisis presents the U.S. with an opportunity to follow a balanced policy of idealism and realism. On the idealistic side, Taiwan warrants our backing because it is, after all, a vibrant democracy. It was a stalwart ally during World War II, engaging an estimated 1 million Japanese troops who otherwise would have defended Japan in the event of a U.S. invasion. In addition, we should be concerned with the fate of the 24 million people of Taiwan if they should become vassals of China's expanding totalitarian regime. On the realistic side, the U.S. depends on Taiwan to supply 2/3 of the semiconductors or chips found in iPhones, computers, cars. We can't afford to have a hostile adversary like Communist China control a leading maker of these chips, nor can we afford an aggressive China breaching the island chain that runs through Taiwan and serves to restrain Beijing. Beijing is testing the United States' will right now as part of its long-range objective of replacing the United States as the world's leading superpower. If we do not respond appropriately, such as conspicuously displaying American strength in the South China Sea, China will step up the pressure on Taiwan. These then are the times that test a nation's will. The Taiwan President Tsai has often observed there's no reason to declare Taiwan's independence because it's already independent. Defending its prerogative, Taiwan's prerogative, to determine its own future, free of Chinese coercion, is in America's national interest, and it's in keeping with our ideals as well. What we do, we can be sure, will be noted closely by friends and allies, as well as adversaries around the world. So, Jimmy, turning it over to you and to our panelists.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. I'm going to say a few words to introduce the event and our panel today. My name is Jimmy Quinn. I'm National Review's National Security Correspondent. This is our latest National Review Institute panel in our continuing Peace Through Strength series. So we've held a series of different foreign policy focused panels, the most recent of which was on House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. So we're following that up today with a broader look at the situation in the Taiwan Strait and some of the more recent developments that have unfolded over the past few weeks. And there's a lot to say about everything that we've seen recently. So who better to have with us than two esteemed experts, both from the American Enterprise Institutes, both of whom who have extensive government and scholarly experience looking at US policy towards China and toward East Asia more generally. We have with us Dan Blumenthal, the Director of Asian Studies at AEI, and Zach Cooper, who is a Senior Fellow at AEI. So why don't we just start with a broad overview of where things stand? And I think one of the things that really shape the debate is differing interpretations of what exactly our policy toward Taiwan is, and how that looks in terms of our policy toward China in addition to that. So what is our policy? How would you describe it? And what are sort of the debates that are taking place there? So why don't we just start with Zach?
Well, wonderful, Jimmy. Thank you so much. It's great to get a chance to be here, and thank you, Lee, for hosting as well. And of course, great to be with Dan, my friend and colleague. So my view is that really we're at a very difficult period on Taiwan issues and U.S.-China relations, and I think the tension that we're seeing right now is really one that is in some ways embodied by the different perspectives in the Congress and the White House. And this is nothing new. Anyone who's followed Taiwan issues can go back 50 years and more and see divisions between the Congress and the White House over Taiwan issues. But I would summarize them like this. I think the Congress feels that Taiwan is under increasing pressure, as it is, and therefore, there needs to be a societal effort to show support for Taiwan, right? It's a leading democracy, it's a hub of innovation, it's home to 24 million people. For all of these reasons, members of Congress, they want to uphold those democratic rights in Taiwan. And they think that actually, if we keep going on the status quo, we're going to be in a very difficult position. And I think that's exactly right. So they're looking for ways to help substantively. And as I'm sure we'll talk about, there's a piece called the Taiwan Policy Act, which is moving through Congress, which would do a whole range of things that would provide a lot of substantive military support to Taiwan. But they also want to help symbolically, right? Because in part, I think they believe that actually the status quo is eroding, not just because of these military issues, but also because Taiwan needs to be upheld politically. And Dan has done a lot of work on the political challenges that Taiwan faces. And I know he'll talk about that. I think the White House view is slightly different. They also believe that we need to do a lot more substantively to help Taiwan on the military side and on the economic side, but they're probably more skeptical of these efforts to help diplomatically with more symbolic efforts like renaming the offices which represent either the US or Taiwan in each of our capitals. And so I think what you're hearing is a little bit of disagreement between the Congress and the White House. We saw this over the Pelosi visit. We're seeing the beginnings of it over the Taiwan Policy Act. I think we'll see more of these debates over the next few months. And I'll hand it to Dan, but my view is it's just absolutely critical that the White House and the Congress get on the same page on Taiwan. I think the thing we can't allow is to make it look like the US is somehow weak or divided on these issues at this very critical time.
Thank you, Dan.
So do you want me to go back to what the policy is or to?
Yeah, why don't we start with that and then we can discuss.
Well, I think Zach answered the question in the main. We have a official diplomatic relationship with the People's Republic of China, run by the Chinese Communist Party, and a very strong unofficial relationship with the Republic of China on Taiwan, sometimes just called Taiwan. And that unofficial relationship is what most of this contest and competition is defining what that means. And that's really been going on since 1979, when President Carter broke relations officially with Taiwan and broke the Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan. I would say that the PRC and Washington have long been competing in imposing what their sense of reality is in the Taiwan Strait. So the PRC believes, the Chinese Communist Party believes, that the Republic of China ceased to exist in 1949 after the Civil War. It was CCP led a violent insurrection to take down the ROC, and the ROC retreated, which was the duly constituted government of China, as Dr. Edwards had mentioned, in our ally in World War II. And the ROC, led by the KMT party, retreated to Taiwan, and from there claimed sovereignty over all of China. So for the first phase of this competition, there was a competition between the KMT and the CCP over the fantastical claim of which Beijing or Taipei actually was the sole legitimate government of all of China. We'll fast forward till today, where Taiwan has become a democracy, and in some very important ways, it has accepted reality. It stopped claiming to be sovereign over all of China. It stopped claiming to be the sole legitimate representative of all of China. It has relations with 20 countries, diplomatic relations in its constitution, which both major political parties in Taiwan accept, the DPP and the KMT. It is, in fact, a sovereign, independent state. It's not recognized by us as such. So but we have a very warm relationship with it. And we also have the Taiwan Relations Act, of course, in the Congress, which is a legal requirement to do two important things. One is to maintain Taiwan's capacity to resist, and the words here are very important, coercion in the Taiwan Strait. That's how the Taiwan Relations Act is written, against the people of Taiwan, and maintain our own capacity to resist coercion of the people of Taiwan. Our policy for a very long time has been to do just that. Ronald Reagan interpreted the policy to say that we will take note of China's stance in terms of the requirement to oppose coercion based on China's military modernization across the Strait. But there's a lot of dispute, and our policy is for a peaceful resolution of the dispute between Taipei and Washington. That should still be our policy. Beijing is rejecting every creative solution that has been put forth about how to solve this problem. The Taiwanese have put forth over the course of 20 or so years many different formulas and solutions about how we can solve this issue. One China, two areas, one China, two governments. The CCP has a very maximalist position, which is Taiwan is a sovereign part of China, period. And it should accept that. It is imposing and coercing the United States to accept that definition. The contretemps over the Pelosi visit, in my view, was a part of this ongoing 25-year coercion campaign to get us to accept China's definition of what is allowable between us and Taiwan. So I view what some view as symbolic, such as congressional visits and speaker visits, as actually key to defeating China's strategy, which is we must make sure that Taiwan is not isolated, that its political morale is not sapped, and these kinds of things that are dismissed as symbolic are actually, in my view, very substantive. That's a lot. I said a lot. I mean, there's a lot to say about the Taiwan policy, but it's a very confusing policy, and it's contested constantly.
All right. Well, thanks, Dan. And I should add for our audience, feel free to send questions in through the chat box below at the bottom of your screens. And I'll try to pick questions throughout the discussion and kind of throw them in. So back to the Taiwan Policy Act, but both of you have mentioned this ongoing debate that's taking place. I think that reports have said Congress will consider it in September. And there's really an ongoing discussion, as Zach and Dan both alluded to, about whether this is the right time for these more symbolic measures, about sort of the exact way in which the US and Taiwan engage diplomatically, what you call certain diplomatic outposts, and sort of these, I guess, restrictions on contact between US officials and their Taiwanese counterparts. Zach, do you think it's the right time to go about doing what the Taiwan Policy Act, as it's currently proposed would suggest to do?
Well, I think most of the Taiwan Policy Act is just absolutely critical, right? And, you know, to be really honest, we've talked, and Dan and I have done this for years. We've talked for years about how we need to do more to help Taiwan. And the reality is we actually just haven't done that much, right? Especially on the military side. You know, a decade ago, we talked about rebalancing US focus towards Asia. And the end result, if you actually look at the details, is we've done a little bit, but certainly not nearly what we should have done. So there's a whole variety of things in the Taiwan Policy Act that I think are really important about changing how we provide military support to Taiwan and bolstering what we do provide, and really mandating that the US work more closely with Taiwan's military so that we can repel not just invasions, but, you know, political coercion, other types of scenarios, whether it's blockades or seizure of an outlying island, all of this wide range of activity that we could see. So I think that's really critical. Where Dan and I may have slightly different views is I do think there's a set of things, and, you know, I'll give you an example. There's a provision that would name Taiwan as a major non-NATO ally. And this is the kind of thing that for me, it's not particularly substantive, because there's actually a previous US law that named Taiwan as having all of the benefits of a major non-NATO ally, but actually not naming them formally as a non-NATO ally. So if you look up on State Department website, you'll actually see that Taiwan has all of these benefits. But, you know, the formal naming, I think, would be the kind of thing. Does it help Taiwan? In my view, probably not, because they already have all the benefits. Is it going to spur a pretty strong reaction from China? Yes. Now, I want to be really clear. We shouldn't do things or not do them because the Chinese are going to be upset. That's a terrible rubric for how to make decisions. And there are times when the US is over-relied on that issue to determine what we do with Taiwan. And that is the wrong approach. But I do think we're going to have to take into account, you know, sometimes, is this policy change worth the change in the status quo that the Chinese might try and impose, right? And that was sort of my concern around the Pelosi visit. Is the status quo is now shifted, unfortunately, post the Pelosi visit, in ways that I think hurt Taiwan. So I think we have to ask some of those similar questions here, which is, are there things that we have to do even if the Chinese are going to be upset? Absolutely. Lots of the arms sales fall into that category. Are there things that we maybe should rethink because they don't help as much substantively, but will still upset the Chinese? Possibly. I think that, you know, there are a couple of parts of the Taiwan Policy Act for me that fall into that bucket. But I know Dan has a different response, and he's worked on this for a long time. So interested to hear what he has to say.
Well, I mean, Zach's argument is quite compelling, and we have to take very seriously the fact that the military balance has changed so dramatically. When I started working on Taiwan issues at the Office of the Secretary of Defense in 2002, it wasn't as dramatic. The military balance in the Western Pacific was in the U.S. favor. So we have to take account of that. We have to take account of that reality without a doubt. So it kind of depends. I would say two things about approaching the Taiwan issue. So the narrative out there right now, the kind of conventional wisdom, which it may or may not be right. I think I mostly disagree with parts of it. Is that the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is waiting to effectuate an invasion and occupation of the island in the next 4 to 5 years, or some other massive use of force in order to annex Taiwan. And it's waiting for certain kinds of capabilities to effectuate that very difficult amphibious invasion. Famously, at least in our circles, Admiral Phil Davidson, who was leaving Indo-PACOM Command at the time, said there's a timeline for this to happen. So if you view the state of affairs as, for a whole host of reasons, Xi Jinping is impatient with simply deterring formal independence or more formal independence, and China has the will and capacity to do something about it, then you have to, you would view things that are symbolic or called symbolic in a different way. My view is that since 1995, China has been successfully, in many ways, coercing, using force on an almost constant basis to create a climate of fear in the United States and in Taipei to change the status quo. And they believe, if you look at their doctrine and writing, that they are in a constant state of struggle. They call it struggle, political struggle, armed struggle for legitimacy. And Taiwan, the existence of a separate entity, the ROC on Taiwan, is just a blow to the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, because it undermines their claim that they rule all Chinese people, right? So they, in my view, have been coercing through aerospace power. They've been building up to these constant intrusions in the ADIZ since at least 2005, when they were writing about it, when they watched what the United States did in Kosovo and the first Iraq War, and wanted to do the same thing. And U.S. and Taiwan policy is made in the context of a climate of fear and of a constant threat to inflict more harm. And it's having a psychological impact upon us. And if you take that view, that an invasion then would just be an escalation of an ongoing political and armed struggle, then you take that view, and the struggle is actually over legitimacy. That in fact what the PRC is trying to do is undermine the legitimacy of the existing government on Taipei. Then these symbolic things matter more to undermine a coercive psychological campaign. So in that point of view, the United States has to work with Taiwan to give it signs of legitimacy in the international space, short of statehood, short of formal statehood at this time, because that would lead to war, but increasing signs of legitimacy to fight back against the Chinese attempts to essentially say, you are not a legitimate government, you are part of China. And if you view it from this kind of constant political contest point of view, that's where I come to my conclusions on why some of the symbolism matters more than some others might think.
Zach, can I get you to weigh in on the Davidson window? I know this is a topic of fierce debate among China experts. Are we too focused on this very specific 5-year, 6-year period that Admiral Davidson laid out before Congress, I think last spring? Should we be focusing more on sort of gray zone threats, and what are those sorts of threats that don't necessarily rise to the level of a full out invasion, but are still a threat to Taiwan's legitimacy and security? How should we be thinking about all of that?
Yeah, and first, I think a lot of what Dan just said is really compelling. And the Davidson window, as people have talked about it, right, is this idea that maybe between now and 2027 that China would build up its capabilities so that it could launch an invasion in 2027 or around 2027. There's a big debate in the community about whether that's what would really drive Chinese decision making. I would say two things. First, I'm not sure that the time that the idea that China has a specific time in mind is really backed up by a lot of evidence. I do think it's very clear that China is doing everything possible to build up these capabilities as soon as possible, right? And look, that means, can we be sure that nothing's going to happen in 2024? No way. I actually think 2024 in a lot of ways is a much more dangerous period than 2027. And here's why. Because, we have two political events that are happening, we know, in 2024, an election in Taiwan and an election in the United States, both of which could, I think, be the kind of thing that the Chinese would seek to influence, would respond to. If you get a leader in Taiwan who's pushing back more against Beijing, China has absolutely shown the willingness to try and use all kinds of coercion to shape the political discourse in Taiwan. It's often done so terribly, but that doesn't mean that it won't try. And just read the headlines, right? In the US on Taiwan issues, this is going to be an election issue. It may not be the top issue in the 2024 election, but it's going to be an election issue. And I think there are a lot of people, including some of our old colleagues, like John Bolton said a few days ago, that he thinks we should formally recognize Taiwan as an independent sovereign country. I think there's going to be a debate going on in some parts of the political class in the US about that too. So in my view, what's clear is that we're now in what some of our colleagues are calling sort of the danger zone, right? The temperature is raised. Does the danger zone start in 2027? Does it get the worst in 2027? I don't know. But I think, we're heading into a period in 2024 that's going to be very difficult. There you go. Dan has written a great book called The China Nightmare, which you should also get. So we're heading into this danger zone, this nightmare period, whatever you want to call it. I don't know exactly what the timeline is. I don't think the Chinese do either, but what's clear is we have to do much more than what we've done previously to try and stabilize the situation.
Yeah, Dan, how should we be thinking about all of these political events in Taiwan, the US, the elections in 2024? This fall, General Secretary Xi will probably walk away from a major party meeting with another term and a solidified grip on power. What should we make of all of that?
Well, Zach is right. The focus is certainly on the Taiwan elections of 2024. I'm of the view that China views itself, the CCP, I should say, views itself in a constant political struggle, and is engaged on Taiwan constantly in what they call political work. People might know of that through terms like the United Front working groups and so on, but the CCP theory of its victory in the Civil War was it not just armed struggle, but it disintegrated the KMT and subverted it. It still actively attempts to do that on Taiwan. As Zach said, that's not all that successful. It's been more successful elsewhere, but they're still trying, and they'll never stop. It's a cost they're imposing on the Taiwan political system on a day in, day out basis. They take advantage of deep divisions. So here in the United States, obviously, the fact that the Biden administration and the Pelosi and Speaker Pelosi were divided over the visit was just a gift to China. And on Taiwan, it's quite polarized, new democracy and so on. So lots of room to interfere in the election. Zach is right. So the election in Taiwan, right now, Tsai Ing-wen, the president, comes from the Democratic Progressive Party, which was the not just opposition party, the protest party, but has actually made an incredible concession that the CCP never acknowledges, which is she accepts the formulation that the ROC is that she governs under the ROC Constitution. Which, if you think about it for a second, these are native Taiwanese who were treated very badly by the ROC, and have had to accept reality, also thanks to United States diplomacy, and say that they're not an independent Taiwan, they are an ROC, and they're governed under the ROC Constitution. It's a big concession because there is a Taiwan independence movement that brought her to power. The person that may succeed her is fighting her on that issue. So in Taiwan, the debate on what they call the pan-green side is about whether it's Taiwan's a de facto independent or de jure independent state called the Republic of China, or whether it's the Republic of Taiwan. And China is going to do everything they possibly can if her successor decides to play around with the ROC Constitution and some of the formulations to make sure that the United States comes down very hard on him. That's their MO. And they will use force. They will escalate violence around the Strait in order to scare us into making more concessions. And I would argue that works. I would argue that we've already come further along in the last 20 to 25 years to China's point of view on Taiwan than we otherwise would have had they not been using this violence constantly.
How is that? What have we done to sort of concede that to them?
So in the absence of violence, in the absence of a constant threat of war, if you're talking about a democratic country of 24 million people that's allied with the United States, I mean, frankly, we would have normal diplomatic relations with them. We would not pressure them to not have referendums about their future, which we've done. We would not pressure them to say certain things in their inauguration, which we've done, that come further along to accepting at least our definition of a one China policy. We've gone against some basic values. I mean, we still do a lot. We support Taiwan's democracy, but because of our fear of escalation, because of our concern about Chinese military activity, because of these saturation of constant exercises around Taiwan, we make our policy in this climate of knowing that China may react or overreact to any move that they interpret as us deviating from their definition of what one China is. We have our own definition. Again, China has never acknowledged our massive concessions on this, not massive, big concessions on this issue, including, by the way, the original concession, which was breaking a tie with an ally during the Cold War in order to get normalization, right? But anyway, right now, the situation across the strait is that the sanguine's quite moderate, and we do quietly pressure the Taiwan government to come more in line with our view of what the one China policy is.
Zach, so to pick up on what Dan said about the potential for escalating violence around Taiwan or escalating exercises, a lot of experts have talked about a heightened level of military activity following Pelosi's visit that could more or less become permanent. It's sort of a new status quo in a sense. How is that shaping decision-making across the strait and in Washington?
Yeah, I do think there's a concern, right, that the U.S. can't let Chinese pressure change the status quo. And this is why, some of us have been calling for the U.S. to do a bit more of a forceful response. And finally, we saw it just a few days ago with 2 U.S. cruisers sailing through the Taiwan Strait, and then reportedly a 1.1 billion arms sale package being put through. That as Dan knows far better than I do, the big question will be not just what gets approved, but actually what gets to Taiwan and how quickly it gets there. So I don't want to suggest that this is a done deal. So I think we're seeing a little bit of an effort by the Biden team to make sure that the response to the Pelosi visit doesn't change our actions and to show that we're going to still hold firm. But look, I mean, there's some things that are just hard for us to respond to or to stop, right? So I think one of the things that it appears the PRC is trying to do is sort of erase what we call the median line. So this is sort of the halfway point between Taiwan and China in the Taiwan Strait. And it used to be that crossings of this median line were fairly rare. And over the last month, we've had just dozens and dozens of cases that people have tracked. I think this is pretty clearly something that Beijing is going to continue to do. It's hard for us to stop. We're not likely to directly challenge an aircraft that is crossing the median line. Taiwan has been extremely restrained over the last month. I think this is one thing that doesn't get enough attention. Tsai Ing-wen has been very, very careful and responsible through her whole time in office, in my view. So I think, unfortunately, we're seeing different elements of the status quo change, right? There's more economic pressure on Taiwan. One thing I worry a lot about is there are 14 countries that recognize Taiwan, and this is what Dan was talking about earlier. One way of giving Taiwan diplomatic space, right, are these countries that still recognize the Republic of China. I think we'll see Beijing try and peel away some of those 14 over the next few months. And they've had some success doing this in recent years. So I think we're going to see military pressure. We're going to see economic pressure. We're already seeing lots of political pressure and diplomatic pressure. Unfortunately, I think it's hard for us to stop all of that. What the US can do is show that we're not going to be deterred by Chinese actions. And I think, in the immediate aftermath of the Pelosi visit, the administration was trying to be quite careful not to escalate. But I think now there's a real need for them to show some firmness and to show that, the Chinese may be trying to change the status quo, but that isn't going to change our behavior. Unfortunately, though, that still means that the status quo is probably to some degree weakened over the last month, right? Because we are seeing these median line crossings, because the Chinese have launched missiles, not just into waters over Taipei, but into Japan's exclusive economic zone. Like, this is a new world. And I think, one of the ways we're going to have to respond is just by being much, much firmer in the whole range of actions that we take, from military to political to diplomatic.
So there's the median line issue is one of these areas in which Beijing is trying to erase the status quo. Another flashpoint that's emerged in recent days is around the islands of Kinmen, where the PLA has essentially sent some surveillance drones. I don't know if it was directly over the island or just in the general area, but there was one video of Taiwanese soldiers that were stationed there that went viral on Chinese social media, because the Taiwanese soldiers were kind of just gawking at this drone up in the air. And so Chinese netizens were basically making fun of Taiwan's lack of ability to respond to these threats. And I think today the Taiwanese actually started to fire on these drones. So these are unarmed drones. They're more for surveillance purposes, it seems. But when you have a threat like that, where it's almost as if they're sort of probing and they're poking and they're trying to get a reaction, but it falls well short of an outright invasion. If you're the Taiwanese, how do you respond? If you're the U.S. government, how do you assist Taipei in crafting that response?
Well, in line with my interpretation of events, the comprehensive coercive campaign is meant to sap Taiwan's political will, and has been for a very long time. So the demonstrations of force to show Taiwan can't do anything about those demonstrations, and then are usually followed by sometimes deep fakes, things that didn't really happen around the Penghu Islands. I'm not saying that's what happened in Kinmen and Matsu, but sometimes deep fakes, always social media campaigns and other campaigns to essentially tell the Taiwanese that they're on their own. Again, the strategy, in my view, is to build up sufficient force and use psychological and other political warfare operations to, it's one thing for Taiwanese public to say they do not support unification when they think the United States can still do something to assist them. It's another thing entirely if the coercion campaign is escalated and there's more violence and they feel isolated. So I think that's the Beijing strategy. So the answer to that is obviously keeping in line with our obligations under the Taiwan Relations Act and speeding up military equipment, and not just military equipment. There's nothing in the One China policy, our understanding of the One China policy, our definitions of the One China policy, that stops us from speeding up training and equipping training. Everything short of official diplomatic recognition. There's nothing in those documents that stop us from doing that. Obviously, an accelerated program of training and equipping the Taiwanese and working with the Taiwanese together, to work on how we would notionally fight together should we have to, is number one. And that not only deals with the military threat, but that also gives a very strong political signal to the public in Taiwan and to China that we are not breaking our commitments. And that is the key to defeating this coercion campaign. Okay. There are other things, I hate to jump in, Zach and I probably agree on a lot of this. So there are other things that, free trade agreements. I mean, anything you can do to bolster Taiwan's legitimacy in the international space, its conduct of political affairs, its conduct of commercial affairs, is helping to defeat the coercion psychological campaign. Of course, they need arms. That you can't do that without arms, but that's necessary but not sufficient in my view. And the last thing I would say, because we keep coming back to this, you might ask this question, Jimmy. Well, what's wrong with recognizing Taiwan then, given what you've all said? And there's a key problem, and that is the other part of this is bringing along allies. So we need an international coalition. China needs to know that this issue is not a local domestic issue. That's how they're trying to define it, through political warfare, through legal warfare. Zach mentioned the median line. They're now defining those waters as internal waters. That's legal warfare. We need a response that as many people, and this is something the Biden administration did well. It's not enough, but they did well once they found their footing, was to get the G7 and ASEAN and Japan and just about everybody to sign on to certain language about the Taiwan Strait. Again, these things are very important.
Okay. And so back to this concept of giving Taiwan the diplomatic space to operate in. Zach, you mentioned the 14 allies that officially recognize Taiwan diplomatically. We've got an audience question about whether the US made a mistake in embracing or in crafting its one China policy, and also about Taiwan's basically ejection from the UN in the 1970s. I guess the question is, well, was that a mistake? But I mean, should we have thought harder to have, prevented the PRC government from assuming the China seat there?
Yeah, look, so this is such a hard question, right? And it's hard because you have to remember that the logic of the decisions that Kissinger and Ford and Carter and Nixon made in the 1970s were not primarily driven by any concern, necessarily about China. They were driven really by the concern about the Soviet Union and trying to build on the Sino-Soviet split that had happened, over a decade earlier. So I think it's hard to deal with this question now, knowing what we do about how the Cold War ended and dealing with the China we have today. What I would say, and I'm interested in Dan's view on this, my frustration is that if you go back and you look at a lot of the founding documents that define the current terms of our relationships, both with China and with Taiwan, they are so murky, right? The 3 communiques, the 6 assurances, the Taiwan Relations Act, a lot of the discussions around these agreements and statements and bills, part of the reason that there's so much lack of clarity around what our policy is and what it has been is because a lot of that was intended, right? This ambiguity was sort of the only way that the US and the Chinese could square this circle of how we were going to build a direct diplomatic relationship when we couldn't agree on the core issue of Taiwan. And so we fudged it, right? And this is how you end up with the Chinese saying that the US has agreed to one China principle that we never agreed to, right? Because we say we acknowledge their views, but not that we actually agree with them. And that is at the core part of the difference. So I think what's particularly difficult now is, yeah, of course, it's easy to say 50 years ago, we should have been much more thoughtful in how we, phrased a whole bunch of these documents and statements. That's absolutely, I think, the case. But having been given these core documents, statements, laws as they're written, I think now the question is, can we be just a little bit clearer in ways that stabilize the existing relationships without going too far in ways that basically begin a conflict, right? And I think that's going to be a lot of the debate that we have over the next few years. Are there ways that we can send a clear deterrent message to Beijing and more assurance to Taiwan without formally breaking, our one China policy? And I think the answer is yes. But boy, this is difficult. And the details are so difficult to understand that, you've got top leaders in the US that don't really understand them, including sometimes the president, right, when he makes statements. And this is true of President Biden. It's been true of previous presidents as well. So I think, unfortunately, we're so stuck with the statements we have, and we're going to have to do our best to try and make the parts of them that are opaque and very ambiguous slightly clearer, but to do so in ways that don't trigger a conflict over the next few years.
Dan, do you want to add anything on that?
Well, there's an important point, which is at the time, Chiang Kai-shek, who was the leader of the ROC, which was a one-party dictatorship. I mean, certainly less anathema to us than the CCP, but rejected out of hand a two China's formula. Because going back to my opening remarks, both sides were competing over who was the sole legitimate representative of all of China, right? I think the reason that the status quo is so hard to define is because Taiwan democratized, right? So Dr. Edwards mentioned before this lean back and forth from a realistic foreign policy to an idealistic foreign policy. And the people who were shaping the policy, Kissinger and Brzezinski and so on, just couldn't imagine that 23 million people might democratize and not do exactly what we would say. There wasn't an imagination about what goes on outside of the diplomatic quarters. When they democratized, it changed everything. So there was no longer a claim that both Chinese on both sides of the Strait represented all of China or agreed that there was one China. So it was a miraculous, peaceful, deliberate process of democratization. That's when Chinese coercion really started, because they could see that this democratization would be a mortal threat to their legitimacy. And also why the status quo is so dynamic, because now you have this unreality of claiming that there's one China, right? When the reality is you have legitimate government in Taipei, sovereign over one island with 23 million people, or 3 islands, and you have a legitimate, and when I say legitimate, I don't mean good and decent, but legitimate recognized government in China, mainland China, sovereign over 1.2 billion people. And that's the reality. And so I think we have to condition China to accept that reality. And that has to be our long-term policy. Right now, the whole idea of diplomacy has disappeared, because that's how China wants it. But a peaceful resolution, not a coerced resolution, a peaceful resolution without preconditions, where Taipei and Beijing sit down. They won't meet with President Tsai. That is not diplomatically, they should pay a cost for not meeting with the person they have a problem with. They don't pay any cost. This is the way they want it: a coerced solution where we do their bidding and deliver Taipei, into their hands, and we just have to stop that.
All right. So we've got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to try to get through some more audience questions here. So how do you view the likely support from U.S. allies in the region in sort of a cross-strait contingency? Different people, former officials and experts have weighed in about the possibility of Japan getting involved militarily, or Australia. What's the role of the Philippines? Maybe both of you could just provide a brief overview of where the U.S. allies are right now.
Maybe I'll go first this time, and then Zach does a lot on the allies, so I'll give him time to I'll filibuster for him. I mean, I think Japan, to the extent possible, given still very conservative laws about use of force and alliance relationships, that I think a lot of people don't understand how constrained they still are, self-constrained. But they're in. I mean, you look at a map, and Southwest Island chain of Japan goes right into Taiwan. Militarily, China can pose a lot of problems without taking Taiwan, but becomes a bit worse if they have sovereign control over Taiwan. I think more in terms of the morale of Japan and the isolation of Japan. So I think Japan has a very fine interest in let's just call it our one China policy succeeding, the way we define it. Taiwan, lasting as a legitimate, entity for as long as we possibly can go. Japan has an interest in that. I think Australia has a broad view of Asian security. It doesn't have a clear, concrete interest as much as, but there is a certain political order in Asia, and it's not just Asia actually. So if you just take the Russia-Ukraine fight and you look at the countries in Asia who signed up with NATO, it's South Korea, and it's Japan, and it's Taiwan, and it's Singapore, and it's Australia, and it's New Zealand. It's essentially the democratic allies of the United States, Taiwan, and that's a pretty big political order, and they view themselves as part of that, and they want to defend that order. And the foundational principle of international relations, that you're not going to use force to settle a legitimacy or sovereignty dispute, is a critical part of that order. So the Australians would be in. The Philippines, let Zach, the Philippines don't, the Philippines, we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I agree with everything Dan said. I think the Japanese have to be in whether they want to or not, probably. And as we've seen, the Chinese are like, it's just too close, right? I mean, there are Japanese islands that are closer to Taiwan than Taiwan is to mainland China. Like it's just a small area, and it's hard for the Chinese to conduct an invasion or even a blockade without affecting Japan in serious ways. I think Australia is the other obvious one that would probably be involved in some way. But I'll be honest, I think most other countries in the region would try and keep their heads down, twiddle their thumbs for a while, and probably wouldn't want to participate directly, which is why making sure that the way that a contingency happens makes clear who the transgressor is really critical, right? I think that would shape a lot of the decisions across the region, and including with some of our partners outside the region. But my guess is, if we enter a major conflict in the near term with China over Taiwan, it's going to be Taiwan, maybe the US, hopefully, I would think, probably Japan, and probably Australia, and maybe that's about it.
All right.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you go, Dan.
The last thing I would say is I agree. These things are very unpredictable, right? I mean, the U.S. and part of the problem here is the U.S. and China are in this intense rivalry, right? So you could see a long extended war over Taiwan. You could see a long extended war over other issues as well. You just don't know. I mean, to go back to Europe before World War I. I mean, not that the analogy is perfect, but there are a lot of things that can spark that conflict. The good thing, I guess, is that China knows that, which is why I think they are trying to coerce short of an invasion until they have no other option. That's not good news. It's just good news that it's not, a full-on attempt to invade. They're worried about things, and we can take advantage of those worries. We are, to some extent. They're very worried about India starting another front. They write about that. So our relationship with India then becomes very important. They're worried about being taken advantage of should they start a conflict. If we really absorb what they write about in terms of their strategic worries, then there are other options to deter.
Okay. So how good is the military of Taiwan? I mean, can we talk about the preparedness of the Taiwanese military? And the second part to that question is basically about the extent to which the government of Taiwan and the military of Taiwan are infiltrated by people who are more sympathetic to the mainland or a different perspective.
Why don't I go first? So democratic transitions, which we love in the United States, a very successful, peaceful transition. Cannot forget that happened. But they're difficult in terms of civil military relations, particularly when the military was such a dominant force for the one-party system in Taiwan beforehand. So there's been years and years of distrust that has led to disagreement and missed time in terms of operational efficacy. The military was set up to take all of China, essentially. I mean, that was what the KMT's purpose was, and to do other things. Also very isolated. We're the only country that will really do anything with it, and we self-restrain doing the kinds of things even that we did with Ukraine to get them ready since 2014, the kind of exercises, very restrained relationship. We have to accelerate our relations with the Taiwan military to help it transform to be a better fighting force. I'll say one thing about infiltration. China infiltrates everybody. As I said in my opening remarks, it is part of the strategic MO. The subversion and disintegration are as important to them as armed struggle in their writings. A lot of times, the high-profile cases in Taiwan that are prosecuted by Taiwan government authorities of espionage are actually run by agents of China's political warfare units, because their real purpose is to really strike a blow against Taiwan's morale. If you have a high-level general who is on the take, the blow to the morale of the public is much bigger than any espionage benefit. Anyway, we all can do more on China's penetration. I mean, all of us. I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, let's go to the next one, Jimmy, because Dan's worked on this in detail for years and years. So.
Sure. So Zach, can I get your perspective on the recent visits that we've seen in the wake of Pelosi's trip? The Guatemalan foreign minister was there, speaking of Taiwan's allies. You've seen some U.S. governors visit now. What impact is that having? Is that sort of playing a deterrent role to a certain extent, or what are sort of the benefits for Taiwan, or potential drawbacks even?
So I think there's some economic benefits, and clearly, like when you've got leaders from some of the 14 countries that still recognize Taiwan, that has a big political and diplomatic effect as well. In general, my view is that, when you get a member of Congress here and there visiting, like especially if they're not in leadership, it doesn't make much of a difference. Now, it can be useful to educate the member so they know more about Taiwan and understand the situation around the Taiwan Strait. It has some small benefit in supporting Taiwan and showing this societal commitment to Taiwan. But I don't think it fundamentally changes the Chinese standpoint. So I think this is more about, assurance or reassurance of Taiwan than it is about deterrence of China. That in my view changes a little bit when you've got much more senior people going, or when you have members of an administration going. But my personal view is, at the end of the day, it's the executive branch that is going to have to make the immediate decision about, in the opening hours of a conflict, whether the U.S. is going to get involved, and therefore the strongest deterrent messages are from the president. Right, which is why when President Biden said on May 24th that he would come basically to Taiwan's aid, that was a pretty strong deterrent message until the team walked it back 24 hours later. So I think the Congress and other leaders, they can really reassure Taiwan. They can show solidarity, but the strongest deterrent messages from my point of view are going to come from the executive branch.
Okay, so we've got 2 minutes left. Let me just follow up on that really quickly, Zach. Do you think Biden was just saying what his view was personally versus some sort of larger strategic gambit?
Yeah, I'm quite sure that Biden did not intend to make a major policy change at the end of May in Tokyo, when he said that the U.S. had a standing commitment to come to Taiwan's aid. But look, he's said it 3 times. At some point, the president's making pretty clear where he stands on these issues. I think what's particularly strange is, we have a president now who's been very clear that he actually does think the U.S. should come to Taiwan's aid. And yet we're in a position where people are questioning more than ever whether the administration is sort of weak on Taiwan. So we've ended up in this strange world where the president's saying incredibly tough things, but for a variety of reasons, the administration looks weak. I think as a result, we're probably going to have to see the administration do some things to try and regain the center of the political debate on this. because I think the last few weeks and months have sort of undermined this message where actually the president was quite clear. And it's probably not a statement that I would have made offhand, but as a deterrent message, I think it's a pretty strong one. I wouldn't be shocked to see him make a misstatement again in the next few months. And I don't think we should assume again that that is something that his team had intended for him to do. Just it comes back to what we were talking about earlier. These policies are really, really complicated and confusing, even for people that have been in the business for decades.
All right. Dan, do you have anything to add really quickly before we conclude?
I do not. I mean, I think Zach has it right. Unfortunately, the President Biden's statements, I think were useful by themselves. I mean, even, it's a complicated diplomatic task to tell the Chinese not to use force to prevent the war, and we should tell them not to use force. And after he watches what's unfolding in Russia and Ukraine, it's probably breaking his heart, right? And don't do it. The complicated, but then when his staff walks it back, it looks like strategic confusion. It doesn't even look like ambiguity. But right now, what we do to make sure that we're able to intervene should he decide to is more important than what he says.
All right, I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you both for taking the time. I know you've both got very busy schedules, so thank you so much. Check out Dan's book. I think Zach has a book on the way as well. So you can find more information about all of that, I believe, at AEI's website. And we also want to thank the Victims of Communism Foundation for partnering with us for this event. We'll see you at the next one. Thank you.
Thanks, Jimmy. Thanks, Zach. Thanks.
Thank you.